An accomplished, excellent instructor, winning numerous mentions for her quality teaching and support of students. Thank you, Simone. And please take it from here.
Thank you, Ahmed, so much for the introduction. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this important conversation and discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion in global supply chain management. DEI is a hot topic, and it's something that's top of mind for supply chain managers in the current environment. So I did a little bit of research, and there's actually a recent study that suggests that 75% of supply chain companies are considering DEI, but only about 40% have concrete DEI initiatives implemented. So clearly there is an intention and action gap that we are seeing in the industry. In the next 60 minutes, we are going to dive deeper into that topic of DEI in global supply chain management. And I'm joined today by 5 experts on this topic. So please let's welcome Kaori Koide, a specialist lead focusing on global supply chain management at Deloitte in Tokyo. She's actively involved in diversity and inclusion efforts at Deloitte and is currently serving as a member of the Broad College International Advisory Board. We also have with us Bill Grice, Vice President and Executive Director of the Michigan Minority Supplier Development Council and the Michigan Minority Development Center in Detroit. He has worked with a broad variety of companies and had an extensive supply chain background. Please also welcome Matt Anderson, Professor of Accounting and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Broad College here at Michigan State University. We have Bob Lundquist, who is currently serving as the manager for the Supplier Diversity Program at Steelcase. He has been with the company since 1984 and served in various supply chain roles through his career. And then last but not least, we have with us Vandana Bahl, Vice President of Trade Management and Supply Chain Solutions. She has extensive supply chain experience also through working with a variety of companies. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your expertise and insights on this important topic with us. For those in the audience, we just had, a little chat around lunch, and when you ask someone what they think DEI is, you will get a lot of different perspectives. So let's start off this conversation and let me ask the panel to share with us what DEI in global supply chain management means for them. Bob, would you like to kick us off, please?
Sure, thank you, Simone. For myself, it's about culture and who we are. DEI is the right thing to do, and it helps the business and the communities thrive where we live. It's expected by our customers and our stakeholders. Diversity brings a variety of thought and innovation into our business solutions, and it's about growing supply chain diversity, attempting to reflect the communities where we live and operate. It requires a system that connects our people that aspire to create this culture, both at a global level and at more local levels with objectives that can be measured and managed. We approach it in at least 3 ways. People through global talent development, where we grow the diverse makeup of the employee base that's within the company. Our dealers, who are our channel to our customers, where we try to provide diverse choices to those customers. And lastly, to our suppliers, where we seek to develop and grow diverse supply relationships. The way I like to think about is it requires a call to action, engaging and trying to make it happen. And we all have to start somewhere. And the big picture goals can kind of get lost sometimes in the day-to-day. I like to think about taking one small step at a time. each day we can ask, what can you do? Or, what can I do to grow diversity? Another way about it is, we make decisions every day where we spend our money. So we vote with our dollars every single day. You can think of that individually and make a choice to spend money with small and diverse businesses. And then within your organization, likewise, you can find opportunities to open up the option or the opportunity for diverse candidates to receive business. So find the person in your organization who's responsible for supplier diversity or diversity in general, and then start learning from them and just kind of get started. That's what I'd like to share on that.
Kaori?
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me today. I come from the consulting industry and specifically in Japan, based in Japan, and Japan being so homogeneous, and probably the DEI represents different perspective for each of us today. We're sitting here today. But in my own organization, I think I put a strong emphasis on how we can equally represent male and female gender diversity, as well as the as Japan's being so intensely heavily very Japanese racial competition. So we're trying to recruit more of the people from the international background, as the diversity in their nationalities for the background is very important. It's getting more and more important. And as the world is getting smaller and smaller, and we are connected, not we're just doing a business within Japan, but we're catering to our clients globally. So to be chosen by the clients globally, we will have to really not just focus on our own perspective, but I would have to be really careful what the other worlds are thinking. Probably wider range of topics, including different topics. So I'm really looking forward to hear what the others have to say.
Thank you. Matt?
And again, thanks for having me here as part of this esteemed panel. I guess I'll approach this from the standpoint of just thinking about the words themselves. In its purest sense, you could think of diversity as just being variability. And I always start there. And if we think about adding equity, again, in sort of a pure sense, has a lot to do with resource base that either entities or people have to work with, and thinking about how do we think about the resource base that people bring to a particular task. And then the inclusion, I think of it as just the idea that people will have their voices heard and in fact be respected. And that's really what I want to talk about a little bit here, is the concept of respecting others. And go and look at a dictionary definition. Basically, you can start with this idea of holding someone in high esteem, but I want to think about it in terms of things like respecting the law. We say that when you do that, you don't violate the law, or one of the things we say that you're considerate of the perspective that other people bring to things like the law. But for me, the bottom line of all of that is a willingness to change one's behavior in response to feedback from others that you're interacting with. And I think that's the biggest area that we often fail to really do things. It's kind of like, if you think about your own kids and how you grew up in a family, parents often are essentially dictators for much of their kids' lives. At some point in your kid's growth pattern, you start to have to actually listen to them and then take their feedback and respond to it in creative ways or in substantive ways where they know that you are willing to now change your behavior in response to the feedback that they're giving you. And what I find is that if you look around the country right now, this notion of responding to people's feedback is one that we're just, I think, losing track of in many, many arenas that we interact in. So again, diversity, I want to make the argument that there is no arena that you can think of where diversity is a bad. Like in agriculture, we say monoculture agriculture is a bad. You think about in finance, you got to diversify your portfolio, but when you come to people, all of a sudden, we have to defend diversity as something that's inherently bad. That somehow we're diluting the quality of the interactions or the quality of the people we hire and so on. I submit that it's just crap. And so all I'm saying is I want us to rethink, reframe the whole notion of why diversity with people inherently makes us somehow more divisive or less inclined to accept quality in the interactions and go from there.
Thank you for your insights, Matt. Vandana?
And thanks for having me. Help to follow that, but I'll try. You know, diversity, again, I feel it's just differences in opinion, difference in thought, and that's important in everything. And it's in everything that we do today. You know, we have to be open to different opinions. We have to be, that's the way to grow. That's the seed. That's the basis of entrepreneurship. The minute you close your mind and thought perspectives to a thing, that's the end of growth. So in business, you have to be able to interact with people of different backgrounds, with different perspectives, and that adds so much value. And we're in a global world. We are not dealing with just other Americans or others that are similar to us. So we have to be able to engage on that level. And there again, having diversity in your own organization opens up the ability to communicate with others. Because we, I think, as human beings, like to work with others that are like us. We have an ability, we have the tendency to gravitate towards what we're familiar with. So if you're working with an organization that has people like you or, you know, unlike you, that can sometimes set the pace. And so I think diversity and including people and equity, all of that for me falls into that little bundle.
Thanks for sharing. Bill?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me this afternoon. I bring you greetings from the Michigan Minority Supplier Development Council and the Michigan MBDA Business Center. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is interesting, right? Because I look back at the time frame and the cycle in which diversity started out, right? And there was a big push in automotive that, you know, they wanted dealerships, they wanted representation of their consumer base, right? So they wanted suppliers, they wanted dealerships, they wanted their plant floors to represent those that were going to buy their cars and vehicles and population. So that word diversity then became an initiative, right? Well, you evolve and then they added equity to that or inclusion, right? So they kept adding to that acronym, if you would, of diversity. Now it's equity and now it's inclusion. So what does that mean, right? So when we start to look at diversity, well, diversity takes on a broad scale, right? Because you look at the population of global footprint right now, we have 8 billion folks on this globe, right? And you look back and how long did it take us to get to the first billion, right? No less the time it took us to get from 5 billion to 8 billion. Well, what does that look like in a population? Well, it looks diverse, right? Well, what does equity look like? Well, equity looks like the footprint of the areas in which the underserved, underrepresented population did not have an opportunity to participate. Why? Because they didn't have that second, third, or fourth generation that now they're following. So there's some equity component to that. Well, inclusion just means we are an inclusive society today, right? Regardless how we look at it. You know, animals operated in this field for a long time. right? You go to a dog park, isn't it interesting that even the dogs play with each other, don't look alike, and you got big dogs and small dogs and, you know, hairy dogs and bald dogs, and they're all just hanging out in this dog park. But it seems like, you know, when we talk about inclusion, when it comes to humanity, we want to put walls up and segregate it. So what does it mean to me? Well, it means that we need to close up the parity gap, right? Because at the trajectory we're going from an equity perspective, it's going to take 333 years to even close the gap. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean? It means everybody in this room, it means everybody that is over the airways that are tuning in virtually.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. So we clearly now get the sense that, okay, DEI is truly something that is important for companies, not just in the US, but around the globe. So I have a question specific to Matt and Bill. DEI, so where do you actually think that this trend of DEI is heading, let's say over the next 5 to 10 years? Where do you see it go? Matt, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, like I said, I didn't mention before, I'm an accounting professor here, so my response will be grounded on in sort of the accounting perspective. And I will also say, just from an academic standpoint, I tend to be very data focused. And I am not at this point really positive about what I see happening, certainly in the environment in which I operate and read and do things in the following sense. There's a recent study, which I actually went up and printed off the first page, but over 60% of diversity officers in the Fortune 500 are either quitting or primed to quit here over the period from like 2021 to 2023. And one of the things you can ask here is, so why is that? Well, most of them say that they're burned out. They are just frankly not happy with the level of resources that have been made available to them, and they just don't see support from the top. Now, I'll just take that again from an accounting perspective. If you think about what people will do in a business, and my comment would be, show me your budget. If you look at the budget that people put together and ask yourself what things are being added, what things are being cut, one of the first things that tends to get cut when things go south, frankly, tends to be programs related to diversity in many areas. And so getting back to the question that was asked directly, where do I see this heading in the next, 5 or 10 years? To be blunt, I have very little idea right now. I think if you go back 2 years, there was a lot, post George Floyd, what happened in Minneapolis. There was a lot of optimism, things were going to change. And then within a year after that, people were already retrenching and cutting back on what they had said they were about to do. And frankly, I'm in the accounting profession. I actually just served on a national board for the accounting profession. And we are certainly seeing a retrenchment of positive outgrowth, let's just say post George Floyd. So when you ask, where do I see this going in the next 5 or 10 years? I think time will tell. Frankly, I'm hoping that things will continue to become more inclusive, equity and all of these things are going to improve. But I also want to offer as perspective, the 3/5 compromise was embedded in the formation of the US Constitution in the 1787 to 1791. If you go back and look at the data from the US Commerce Department and other areas, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and so on, for over 100 years after the Constitution was signed, the wages of a typical Black family in this country was roughly 3/5 that of a white family. And even today, typical Black family, and I'm gonna use Black, so that's what I am, family is about 1/10 that of the average white family in this country. And then it comes and goes. In fact, there's some statistics that say about a quarter of families of color in this country have negative net income, just means they're on public assistance, basically. So all I'm saying is, we have a long way to go. I'm hoping that things will move in a positive direction. I have a lot of faith that it's going to be rapid in terms of real change and real equity and things being manifested in ways that you can measure easily.
Yeah, interesting. Where do I think it'll go in the next 5 to 10 years? Well, I think some of the data is already out there as to, where it's gonna go, right? And I don't think you can look at this diversity component without using another term, and that is minority, right? And, we know the minority majority population was pretty much looked at as people of color and Caucasians, right? So that sort of was the majority minority type framework. Well, diversity kind of looks at it that way, right? What does that diverse footprint look like? Well, I think there's, if the numbers are correct, I think there's 9 US states right now that the majority is the minority, right? In population. Right? So when you start to look at the dynamics of that, you start to say, okay, well, what does that look like in the next 5 years? Do we see a sprawl? Do we see a swelling of that? I mean, at lunch, I learned a interesting statistic, and that is MSU has a lot more foreign students than it does even the local population, right? And when you look at that, okay, well, it looks like a diverse campus. It looks like a diverse society. Well, the two segregators, I think that's going to be really the yardstick in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be the equity and the inclusion piece, right? Because when you look at the infrastructure that's going through right now at trillions of dollars, the government's pumping into the system that minorities really, or the diverse population really don't even qualify for because they don't meet certain criteria, right? Net worth goals, things like this. Well, that gap's going to swell, right? Especially with that amount of resources going through. So next 5 to 10 years, I see the diverse population swelling. I see the equity gap narrowing. That means narrowing that the rich are going to hold more of the resources. In the inclusion, you're going to start to see more of gentrification. You're going to start to see more segregation. And there's going to be heavily dense populations, and you can see it in the housing market today. There's a lot more apartment buildings being built and these things. And, the group that's coming through now really don't even want to own a home, right? They'd rather own an apartment or maybe a condo, right? But so you're going to see dense populated areas, right? The geospat, right? We're studying that right now. So that would be my response to that, diversity, swelling, equity, there's going to be, even a tighter gap there that the wealth is going to be held under a smaller population, and the inclusion is going to be kind of forced in dense areas.
Thank you. Vandana, would you mind adding maybe some industry insights in terms of where's your company seeing, that trend going over the next 5 to 10 years?
So the supply chain, the 3PL world, or that I'm from, we work with a lot of organizations, with a lot of companies, manufacturers, and thus we have to align ourselves with their goals as well. And larger organizations tend to have a department or a requirement, a DEI requirement, such that they have to work with either companies that are minority owned or have a diverse, employee pool. So we are impacted by it as well. But I think not just that, on a business level, I think it even makes good business sense for a company to work with a woman-owned business. I'm just saying that it could be any minority-owned business because quite often they're competitive. You know, their offerings would be potentially a lot, you know, more competitive than their peers. So it makes sense for companies to do that. And I see that trend. You know, we as an organization also have some internal initiatives on how we're going to do this. And you know, we can talk about that later, but see it right within and with the companies that we interact with. It's there.
Awesome, thank you. So what I sense out of it is, you know, everybody is going to be impacted in one way or another, especially when we talk about supply chain and having that relationships with our buyers, with our suppliers. And based on what I also sense out of the conversation is that, you know, especially larger corporations, they already have these departments, they clearly have it embedded in their mission and vision. But, you know, oftentimes we forget the small and medium-sized businesses. So maybe Bill and Kaori, you can add some insights for us in terms of how can companies actually move from DEI as being just, you know, a vision to DEI as concrete, having it as a business strategy and having specific DEI initiatives. Kaori?
Okay, if I can add, I see, well, supply chain industry is very labor intensive. And well, it needs to attract a lot of like talents and human resources. But maybe in the country where it's the population is growing, you know, you have a lot of talents and you have choices. But in my country where the population is dropping and decreasing, we would have to be very competitive and in welcoming to, we have to be very open for the talents to come in. And we got to be very clear that we will, you know, prioritize DEI is what we value, so that the people who is being underrepresented, maybe like women or other minorities, that they feel welcome and feel comfortable to come into the industry, because we literally have to be competitive. I mean, I see like Japan is so much dropping in the population. It has been really male dominant Japanese and full-time job, but it's not the population, only the Japanese has not really been covering that space. So we're trying to open it up to more international people with the different nationalities, non-English, non-Japanese speaking, or we're extending to welcome more women to come into the work, and even trying to top up the job, like working hours to part-time. So anyone who has a restriction to be to work on a full-time basis are coming and supplementing the workload. Otherwise, the world is not going to be sustainable. I mean, well, good for those countries who are growing and in terms of population or has the salary that's advantageous for over, you know, other specific jobs. But really, we have to be strategic and make sure that we would have to welcome anyone that has not been the focus of the main worker.
Thank you, Bill.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You know, there's three words I'll say that it's gonna move the needle, right? And that's, there's gonna have to be cultural integration. There's gonna have to be deliberate intent, and it's going to have to be intentional. And hopefully you all get the opportunity to scan 2 QR codes that I brought with me today. They'll put them up on the screen at some time at the end of this. But we did a parity study with Supplier IO. When I say we as the Michigan Minority Supplier Development Council. And within that study, it said, you know, this is how the landscape looks today. And as we keep going on this trajectory, this is how it will look, you know, if we go forward. So what can companies do? Well, you can get that report for one, right? And then there's some key needle movers that are in there, right? One is you can be intentional in increasing your spend. right? In the supply chain, be deliberate increase in your spend year over year. You can do business with certified minority businesses, right? Those that are certified. And then thirdly, you can create a vehicle for access to capital, right? Because when you look at the separators and what creates that, well, it was those three things that the study brought out. The other thing is that you can, and this is, kind of tongue in cheek here, but we create a platform, Matchmaker 365, being very intentional. When they came out with the new trade agreement, we said, wait a minute, this isn't going to hurt us. Let's find a way within the new trade agreement with our connecting borders to find solutions to make this a border-friendly, do business cross-border and still meet the objectives. So what did we do? We created a portal that allows business to be done between US, Canada, and Mexico and meet Chapter 25 of the USMCA code, right? Trade agreement, right? So now you're intentional, right? So that's what it's going to take for these companies. And at some point, it doesn't need to be an initiative. It needs to be the culture. The culture of our company is that we're doing business globally, we're doing business friendly, we're doing business competitively with everybody. And that's what it's going to take for us to look at this thing totally different than what we have in the past, right? Because we have qualified suppliers. The interesting thing is I used to be a certified minority company, and I didn't even allow my team to say anything about being certified as a minority company until after, right? Because we just do good business, right? There's nothing that we have that we don't do as good as the person down the street, right? So I'm not running faster, not leaping higher, not digging deeper ditches. Understand, we're qualified. And that meets the agenda. We're qualified. So do business with qualified supply chain, right? And then you start to get out of this, DE&I as a buzzword. I love what Matt said. Most budgets that get cut, when times get hard, what's the first department to go? For one, they don't even know where to put the department half the time. Does it go in HR? Does it go in legal? Does it go in purchasing? Where do we put this little D&I thing that we want to do, right? Well, make it a culture, make it part of your culture, and you're not trying to figure out where it fits. So
I could just add something real quick. I think the younger generation, the millennials, the Gen Zers, they are more value-based. And I have so much faith in that demographic that they're the ones that are going to lead change, because for them, they will or will not do business with a company based on their values. I have seen that, they will work with company ABC because ABC company, it sings to them, or it believes in the same things they do. When I was their age, I'll be honest, I wasn't thinking about that. So that is a shifting paradigm that I think that will take the world to a place where it will not need to be a buzzword. It will be life.
I would like to follow up on what you mentioned, Bill, about making it a culture. How can a company make DEI a culture?
well, take down the line, right? Because you think about most organizations operate on KPIs, right? And, KPIs say we're going to meet these metrics, right? Well, when it comes to D&I KPIs, they always seem to be some fluff number that somebody pulled from somewhere. We're either going to do this with people, we're going to do it with our sales, we're going to do it with our sourcing, we're going to do it with, let's do it with lawn care, right? Because that's the safest place to go. Let's do it with janitorial, right? Let's not do it with manufacturing. Let's not do it with our high volume risk areas. Well, when I say culture, I mean, all those walls come down, right? It means that if we are going to have KPIs in our culture, it's going to be just like any other operating KPI we have in our business. It is going to be very deliberate, and it's going to be very intentional, right? And there's not going to be any dividing walls, because now it's who's the best suppliers to do business with, right? Who's going to offer the value, right? And then let's do business with those businesses that we can strategically partner with. That, and it has nothing to do with meeting some sourcing spend goal and that we haven't met. You know, what's crazy? Most of these businesses haven't met these KPI. Anybody that's been in business, if you have KPIs that aren't working, you either make some changes or you figure out how to get a different measure. D&I sourcing has been the only measure that has stayed in place forever. And it seems like it hasn't been hit year over year over year over year over year. Or it hasn't grown at the same pace that everything else has grown in an organization or in their sourcing pool. So hopefully I answered that question, but that's where I see we need to really drive the change.
Matt, you wanted to add
Yeah, I just
something?
wanted to throw in, I spent a lot of years thinking about these kind of cultural issues. If you think about culture, for me, the definition is sort of the rules of the road. How do we play the game in this particular institution? So it becomes very simple in many ways for me. Is what do we reward in this particular environment? If you want to change your environment, you need to think carefully about what it is you reward and what do you punish people for. If you start there, I guarantee you, you will start to move the cultural measures of how things happen in an organization.
Thank you, Matt. I want to build up on this conversation and ask a question to Bob and Vandana. Maybe you guys can share a little bit more insights for us in terms of what are some specific actions. I know you started out with, it's about taking action. What is Steelcase, doing in terms of taking action as it pertains to DEI in their supply chain?
Sure, thanks for asking that. The biggest approach specifically in supply chain is where we're leveraging technology to try to enhance the ability for us to find diverse suppliers. And within that technology to connect it to certain actions that buyers or others in an organization are doing when they're awarding business. So this technology is a single source to settle software program that kind of sits on top of SAP, and it's letting us use that tool so that we eventually can connect decisions that are being made, like the act of making a large spend decision. So as a spending decision is going through the approval process, there's a way to flag it as to whether it involved diverse candidates or not in that transaction that's trying to take place. Other features in it let us do things like, well, if you're going to have a sourcing event and have a whole bunch of companies compete for a book of business, again, you can set that sourcing event up to go through an approval process so that it contains diverse candidates or not. You can set thresholds. Another feature that it has is something around you would call it kind of crowdsourcing, where this software platform is used by a lot of other customers besides Steelcase. And the software can flag your existing supply base and tell you about suppliers that you're already spending money with, but you're not counting them as diverse, but another customer is. So because sometimes we don't have a perfect way of finding out when businesses are diverse. Sometimes they lead with that as part of their capabilities, and in other cases, if you're the buyer, you just may not know that that's the case. So collectively, these different features we're hoping are going to be also a way for us to find a method to expand our diversity program beyond the US, because the software has the ability, as you're adding suppliers to be able to do business with and to get them loaded in your business transaction systems, it requests, hey, send your certification information. And they've set up the software to support a whole bunch of diversity categories that, exist in countries outside of the United States, which naturally we don't know all that well because the US is where we've kind of lived and operated as a diversity program for a few decades, but we're still definitely really learning about what's offshore. I would also want to add a little bit on to some of the other comments that the panel members have had about how can you change and grow the diversity understanding within the company. And one of the approaches that we've taken is this, beyond just supply chain, is that in most of our business functions now, there are employee-led DEI teams who on a regular basis are structuring a dialogue amongst the team and within their business function about what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to them. And it's beginning to have an enhanced effect of all these other parts of the company, going along a journey of helping define what this is going to mean, because I think, like as Matt and Bill and others were saying, it's everybody walks around with kind of a different level of understanding about what it means and what can I do to affect this. And one of the biggest things that this is doing is just creating a dialogue about it, because it can be something that's within an organization that people don't feel comfortable talking about all the time. So it kind of gets it out on the table and it creates an environment where it can grow.
Thank you, Vandana.
Yes, I know we have a lot of initiatives and, but I'll talk about one specifically. And before I do that, I do want to say that it's in an organization, it does start from the top. It does need to be a direction set or a mission or direction to go to from leadership. And we have a lot of women in our leadership team at SCS. So we're very proud of that. But what I'll talk about, what we are doing as an organization, as a company, is we are working with a company called Career Springs. And we are, I guess, what I'm talking about is the actual associates at Supply Chain Solutions. So we're looking to diversify that. Because I think at the end of the day, even though we're working with companies, we're working with people. It's people at our company working with other people. And if you have a diverse pool of people in an organization, it grows that. So we are partnering with Career Springs, and it's what they do is it's a platform for low-income and first-generation students. While they're in college, they start in their high school as a senior, and then they can stay on it till they're in college. It connects them with networking opportunities with advisors. So if there's somebody who's interested in a supply chain role, they could reach out to me because I am an advisor on that platform, and we can have a conversation. I can just be a mentor. And then there's postings. Companies put their job openings on there. And students that fit that, demographic can apply to jobs there. And I think that will be a great way to start. And that is one of the things that we are doing at Supply Chain.
So thank you for sharing those insights. I want to come back to more like something that Matt already alluded to in terms of, and you too, right? If you don't have that top management support, there's nothing that's going to happen at the lower level. So what are some of the challenges for companies, and maybe you have experienced this in your own company, when you try to integrate DEI strategies into your global supply chain? Maybe Kaori, you can talk a little bit about your own experience at Deloitte. Maybe there were some challenges.
Challenges. Well, we try to really support. Well, we have a lot of management support and make it clear that their DEI is one of our top priorities. So, like Matt said, we make it, well, I wouldn't say mandatory, but we set the monthly talks among DEI team on different topics to emphasize and to enhance the understanding of how the DEI plays an important role in like the global supply chain practice. And well, because Matt said something about technology, I wanted to add on to it because like I said, there's some reasons for the or where maybe there's some obstacles or blockers for those people who are not joining actively on the workforce, maybe be the ability to work outside of their home, or maybe their ability to flexibility to work full-time. But because of that blockers that can be taken away or can be removed by using some of the technologies. And I am a strong believer for digital technologies. And we're working on the some platform called Anaplan that it's a software sitting on the SaaS on the cloud basis that where the people making the plans and doing a planning on global supply chain SNOP. It is like it automatically, or well, you don't have to collect the data from the Excel spreadsheet from the previous years or a couple of years ago, but you can plug your numbers in on this software platform where it has the logics and everything plugged in. So that cuts off a lot of data analytical times. And that's for sure, we are cutting a lot of times that was previously spent by planners, SNOP coordinators. With that technologies, I see a lot of like, well, women like me with the kids who has the limitation of the number of the hours that I can work. I have been very effective in coordination or planning that I do. So those technologies are advancing, year by year. So we can bring those technologies or digital tools to enhance and remove the blockers from those people who has the limitation, okay, to actively be involved in the workforce.
Thank you. Bob, anything in your company that you experienced in terms of challenges as you were, going down that way of implementing DEI initiatives?
Yeah, there's lots of them, right? But one that's probably the most frequent companion along the way, I would say, is competing priorities. Difficulty, like most types of initiatives and objectives is, even if you get alignment at a high level, there's always a propensity to say yes to other projects, and then some of the resources that you thought you were going to have, they're not available. They're tied up for a period of time. It takes time and resources to move business, whether to new or existing suppliers. And this can limit the ability to provide opportunities for diverse business candidates to find a way into your supply system. One way to help with that is to work to obtain early understanding about, well, what are these kinds of suppliers that companies or an organization is going to be looking for in the coming year, so that you can kind of jumpstart the process ahead of time. Because if you're trying to execute it and find a new source while you're making the decision to buy something, it's really way too late. Because you don't know who the company is and how well are they going to be able to take care of your needs. So having that early notification is pretty helpful. You can get some clues to it as well by just looking historically at, well, who and what types of suppliers have been added in the last year or two. You can kind of look at the different ways that your organization categorizes them, and you can get an understanding of where you tend to have a propensity to add more suppliers during a year. And that can also help kind of front end that discussion. I would say the other way to kind of attack that is of the competing priorities is to have well understood objectives that apply probably in this case to your buying teams, so that they understand, well, what are the diversity goals and what's their role in achieving it, because their natural mission in life at the organization is to try to balance all kinds of different objectives that are placed on them, which at times invariably are going to conflict. But what kind of makes supply chain fun for me for a long time has been trying to reconcile those things. And sometimes you win at it and sometimes you don't do it as well, maybe, but you get to work across organizations with all kinds of different business functions and personalities. And it always keeps things new and interesting as a result. You're not, pigeonholed kind of in one area.
I like how you said it, that, sometimes you win. So you can also say sometimes you lose. So when we are talking about DEI strategy, these initiatives, right, there is no right or wrong way. It's after we implemented it, we actually can figure out whether it's something that, works out or not.
Mhm.
You also brought up earlier, the panel, that it's a sensitive issue, right? So there are clear pitfalls that a company might face themselves as they are trying to work out their DEI strategies. So Matt and Bill, maybe you two can give us some insights on, your own opinion in terms of what are some of these pitfalls that companies should actually avoid as they are focusing on their DEI strategies and initiatives. Matt?
Let me start. Okay. I'll touch on, I guess, 2 or 3 things here. One, I think it is a mistake to frame change within the context of the status quo. In other words, there's this, I think, implicit belief in a lot of firms that the market as it exists has already done a pretty good job of doing whatever it is we observe. So one of the reasons why we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it seems to me there has to be an assumption that where we are right now is not where we want to be going forward. So accepting this notion that, markets always give us the best people and the best whatever, I think it's just wrong in many, many cases. But that's another thing. The other thing that I will say is that one of the pitfalls too is this failure to pay attention to words. Words matter. And obviously we're going through this period now, and frankly in the US, where people are talking about whether or not something is woke or not or whatever. I'll just say you must pay attention to words. I'll give you an example from my own family. I never allowed my kids, and my wife and I, we had a discussion about this. We wouldn't allow them to tell the other kids to shut up. Very simple sort of thing, but it was just, I thought it was disrespectful to yell shut up at someone. And so we made them find other words when you disagreed with someone, to not yell shut up or whatever, but find a way to respectfully disagree. And I'm just using that as a means of thinking about how do you use words to further conversations without, I guess people say you can disagree without being disagreeable, I guess is one way to think about that. But then the last thing that I'll touch on is that you have to be willing to change the processes and procedures in the organization. I think it's attributed to Einstein that if you keep doing the same thing and expect a different result, it's called insanity. If you are in a place where you think you need to be different, you have to examine the processes and procedures that you have in place. To me, that's the single biggest thing that companies need to do, is examine the procedures to see why you are where you are. And are there things we can do to change those procedures that will help us to get to a different place?
Bill?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I'll tell you, I wrote a couple things down, and Matt said words, right? And I wrote the word hard. So what is a pitfall that a company needs to avoid is using that word is hard, right? D&I is hard. So we're not going to do it. It's hard. The other thing is that most of the time when you talk D&I, they say, well, look, there's none out there. There's none out there in the supply chain that can meet the need. Well, create it, right? If there's none out there, find a way to create it, right? And then the last one I'll say is avoid the pitfall of not being disruptive, right? Because you know, I look at electric vehicles, I look at solar, I look at all of these ecosystems that have been put in place. They've been disruptive, right? When you know, Uber and Lyft came on the scene, you know, the taxi cab industry was disrupted, right? But it created a convenience, right? Created an app base, it created, you know, transportation at a different level, right? But they were willing to be disruptive. When it comes to D&I and sourcing, we play really, really safe in this space, right? We don't want to upset the apple cart. We don't want to, you know, you don't want to poke the bear too hard. You know, we come up with all these analogies as to why and justify the fact that we don't want to hit this thing head on like we hit everything else. We're very passive when it comes to D&I. And, you know, I can tell you, I was telling somebody this the other day. I said, you know, and I'm gonna veer a little bit to left, but you know, it's the whole male dominance environment, right? The machoism and this. I said, you know, I'm probably not gonna be in that group, right? Of that macho group that's saying, because I'm gonna carry some women's bags because they are killing it right now in business, right? Women are just knocking it out of the park in business, right? They're doing some things that are just, I mean, when I run into some women that the first year in business, she did $8 million, and in the next 4 years, she's doing 40, right? My word, she's rocking in this space. So, you know, if I said, well, I'm a man here, and you know, I can't do business with her. No, let's figure out a way to collaborate, right? Use our resources, our strengths and weaknesses. Let's identify what they are. Let's capitalize on our strengths and let's build up our weaknesses, right? Because holistically, if we do this in a collaborated effort, we'll get way down the track together, right? But it's going to take that collaboration. It's going to take disruption, right? As every other industry that's been successful, every other initiative that's been successful, every other cultural environment that's been successful, when it's been disruptive, you've seen change.
Thank you. So we have been talking a lot about, you know, DEI initiatives and strategies, but in the end, as a business, we want to make money, right? Our performance is key. So what are some of the expected outcomes from a performance perspective, whatever take you want to take on it, for firms that are actually implementing DEI? And maybe Kaori, you want to kick us off on that question?
Sure. Well, for instance, the company that I work for, Deloitte Consulting in Japan, has put some KPI regarding DEI initiatives. When it comes to presentation, public panel, we have a panel promise that needs to be represented by there's 3 different groups. 20%, no, it's 40% male, 40% female, and the last 20% should be dedicated by the mix of whatever. It could be different nationalities, could be the people from different it is very, that's last one is very hard to define, but people from different ranks or seniorities to show that we are diversified group of people. So that's the one DEI rule or key measure. But besides that, we also have when promoting people, we're pretty much diversified and equally represented in the staff level. Probably 45% females and 55% male. But when it comes to manager level, the proportion of female drops a lot as you go up the ladder. And when it comes to the partner, the highest ranks, it's very significant. You see very few women. Well, I'm just saying because female male proportion is the one that's very obvious. and visible. So there's still trying to boost the proportion of women among the partners or the manager level, but it may not be, well, that's, I mean, it's nice, but they have a KPI, but I think the other people, if I can go back, is if you have a KPI defined to promote the certain level of certain group, it may not be necessarily be the best talented people. So that's the dilemma. How are we picking the best talented people? Or are we prioritizing more of the KPI satisfaction? That's really the pitfall, and I don't have the answer for that. We're, as a group, like as an organization, we're struggling. Even in my little tiny team, I am trying to maintain the good proportion of all the representation from different groups, but that's still very hard to. Well, as we get smaller and smaller in number, it's very hard to maintain the numbers. So it's easier in a bigger organization to maintain the proportional data.
Can I comment on something I said? When I talk about disruption, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Because if you heard her response to her cultural organization, they didn't have enough women, right? So they have a KPI, but they want the best talent. Well, you already know the answer. You haven't cultivated the best talent in women, so how do you think it's going to be a small selection? So yeah, you won't have a population because you haven't cultivated it. So when I say disruption, that's exactly what I'm saying. In order to change that number or hit that KPI, you have to be disruptive with your pipeline that's coming in your development processes that's getting them to achieve that goal of having the best talent. Or otherwise, you can't have a KPI that says I'm gonna have the best talent, but then I wanna increase my women population in my workforce, but there's not enough out there. Well, you didn't disrupt it and didn't cultivate it. So what pool are you gonna pick? So.
Thank you. I want to come back to something that Bob had mentioned. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the outcomes that actually Steelcase had by implementing, that software you can flag a supplier as being diversified or not.
Well, I have to say it's still a working process where you haven't gotten all the way through it. Like most software projects, it takes months and even years to get it fully implemented. We've got it running, but the diversity features have only partly been turned on. So it's something that we're still experimenting with. And so I can't really say that it's had a significant impact quite yet, but we can see in the software, it's telling us about a couple hundred more suppliers than we currently have listed as diverse, but they may or may not meet the criteria that as an organization we maintain, where we require third-party certification that the supplier has had versus the self-certification approach. So it's very likely that some of these companies are, ones that we won't be able to count. But we're just initiating that, working with the software and trying to line up some summer interns that hopefully will work on that for us.
So what impact are you expecting that this program will have? This initiative?
A couple things. We currently have around just shy of 100 diverse certified businesses that we spend money with on an annual basis, a little over $100 million US, and a little over 800 small businesses. So we're hoping to see that count of both, the sheer number of companies grow and the overall spend also to climb as a result of utilizing these features in the software, which those are our kind of two main KPIs, so to speak, that we have in supply chain: percent of diverse spend, and keeping track of, hey, are you getting a nice distribution of, not just all, say women or Hispanic and so on through all the different categories. Trying to keep a balance.
Thank you. I think over the last hour, we were able to peel away the different layers that DEI lays in global supply chain management. I have one last question for my panel, and I keep it brief, and I ask the panel to keep it brief. But in order to close out our discussion today, in one sentence, please share with the audience what your main message is that you would like the audience to take away from today's discussion. Let's start with Bill.
Well, I'll sum it up this way, be deliberate, be intentional, and be disruptive. Be deliberate, be intentional, and be disruptive, because that is going to impact the change in your culture. It's going to impact the change in the results. It's going to impact the change in the economic paradigm.
Vandana?
I think my one sentence would be keep an open mind and see where we can get, how much we can, keep an open mind.
Matt?
I guess I would say it will actually be a couple of sentences. And that is, you have to have a willingness to change. But the point I guess I would leave is that a lot of diversity initiatives and other things, and this is a paraphrase of a quote that I saw, is that it's like planting trees under whose shade we do not expect to sit. There's so often we try to put these things in place and expect change in 1 year or two, and we've been doing this for 300 or 400 years. So all I'm saying is, let's give it some time to see what happens.
Kaori?
Well, DEI is not an option anymore. It is a mandatory, required, best strategy to keep yourself on this competitive world. So it's not an option anymore. You have to take it.
Well,
I would say it's about opportunity. Take the opportunity, keep an open door to listen and connect diverse suppliers with the decision makers in your organization.
thank you for closing out our discussion. With that, we are going to open up the floor for questions. I think Ali is helping me with the online questions. Let's start with the in-person audience. Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned about some disruptive forces. And then too, when I teach my MBA students, I always talk about the impact of technology and globalization, right? And during lunch, we had some discussions around that topic, especially how technology affects DEI practices and how maybe, the fact that we are, we can meet over Zoom, or we can have, we can get work done virtually, not without, you don't have to go to office. What do you think about these, or in your experiences, how technology and globalization? So the second piece we haven't really discussed during lunch, but globalization, in my opinion, is also affecting DEI practices. So what do you think about those? And in your experiences, what were the implications of these two major disruptive forces on DEI practices in the US and globally?
Who wants to take it?
Technology, I think, it's a great leveler. That's what's going to level the playing field. It gives a lot of people opportunity to partake. Even people with disabilities that in the past may not have been able to be, that's a minority too. That's a group of people that have been marginalized or don't have enough voice. So to me, technology is a winner. And talking about disruptions, COVID was a major disruption. It's a bad thing that happened, but a lot of good came out of it. So I guess disruptions aren't something to be afraid of either. And I think technology is going to help.
I think that's something we talked about during the lunch. Well, I know a lot of we can agree onto it. I know COVID has affected a lot of people in a negative way, but has worked out in a positive way for some of the people who has limitation. For instance, that I was required to travel a lot extensively prior to COVID. And a lot of my project involved in travel outside of, my area. And I couldn't really take it, but because of, everything went online, Zoom, and we flew through the last 3 years, we can deliver the project without facing the clients face to face, that everything done online throughout the Zoom. And that has given a lot of flexibility for women or, people with a disability or limitation to travel overseas. So while I was staying home through Zoom calls, we completed a lot of projects. We proved that a lot of things that we had a limitation prior to COVID were proved to be able to done from home with the help of technologies. I mean, people were not really used to using the Zoom prior to COVID, but because of the disruption, we were forced to use the technology. That worked out really well. And a lot of people has been able to participate in the workforce. So that was a win.
Yeah, I'll comment on that too. The interesting thing is that, we seen through Matchmaker 365, the opportunity for a Mexican company and 2 American companies to form one entity where individually they all probably would have invested capital in regions to try to expand their footprint. They were able through the Matchmaker 365 portal to find out the needs and the sourcing opportunities. And then to look at each other's footprint and say, geographically, where should we be? They never shook hands and put together an operating agreement to file a Delaware company. That would have probably never happened prior to COVID, but they did all of this virtually. And we facilitated putting that together. So now there's a facility sitting in Mexico that 2 African-American guys are going to put business down there. And then 1 Hispanic that now has the opportunity to do business in the US and not have to put capital in the US because there's a footprint already through their collaborative that they put together, right? Now they created one entity. So that's a perfect example of how technology was used, business acumen, and now they're going to expand the customers' availability to source into that platform and then get a multiple region effect for sourcing.
We have questions from the online audience.
Yes, we have 2. One of them we touched on, it's how has COVID aided or hurt DEI efforts? So is there anything else to add, or do you think we've covered that? You're good? All right. So the next question, it's a little bit long, but have any of the organizations added belonging implications to their DEI programs? There is more discussion indicating that inclusion may be a step to truly feeling a sense of belonging, but inclusion on its own doesn't go the distance. The idea being that unless an organization makes the conscious effort toward belonging, the relationship between inclusion and belonging is similar to the relationship between diversity and equity. Diversity being a great step, but equity is the real measure of success. So to repeat the question, have any of the organizations added belonging to their DEI programs?
Sure, the answer is yes. Now, I was talking about the accounting profession. That's one of the big things that we discussed. But that was also layered in the concept of respect. If you think again about respect as being willing to change your behavior, what our discussion was about was the idea that indeed people talk about inclusion, but they keep doing business the way they've always done it in the past. And the way that belonging sort of comes into that is, again, this willingness to be actually take into consideration the feedback you got, change your behavior. And that is really how belonging gets incorporated into things. It also ties into the concept of restorative justice. If you think about a lot of businesses might go do business around the globe, a restorative justice concept would say that you don't get true justice unless the people you harmed has input into the solution that's developed by everybody. And that's another concept of belonging, where you know that you had input, it was listened to, and the outcomes reflect the fact that there's been this interchange and the outcomes developed with input from everybody.
Those are the only two questions that we have online.
You have another question from the audience?
So as a student, I guess, I have a question that's probably more for all the panelists. But have you guys, like, in either the workplace or academia, had a situation where you felt there was unfairness in DEI, and how did you go about approaching that? Kind of twofold, as a student who's going into industry soon and graduating here in a few months, what would your advice or approach be if I were in a situation where I'd see unfairness, or kind of my take on how I go about taking on that?
Well, I'll take it. You know, I think if I understood your question correctly, you're graduating in a couple months, you're gonna be entering the industry. And if you found a situation where there was some deliberate, I guess, segregation or racism, or, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I'm thinking that's the question you were asking. Well, I mean, most organizations do have HR policies that they deal with those types of situations. So entering an industry, definitely go through your HR organization. What I can tell you is, you know, here there is a employee protection system, right? And that's an EEOC. And that is a living, breathing mechanism that, you know, closes up some of that gap. Now, that's all the soft and fuzzy, right? Now, the reality is this stuff happens every day, and you have to figure out ways to navigate through the culture of an organization in order to eliminate it, right? Because the reality is it's happening, right? Now, that's where the masses come together, right? And we start to eliminate some of those barriers. So that's, hopefully I gave you a couple things that can help you, because the real world says it does still exist, right? We see it every day. We see it. We see it internal races, external races. I mean, you know, when I'm in Grand Rapids and I hear, you know, some African-American shot another African-American, I'm like, what the world, right? It's like, well, is that racism, or is that, what is that, right? Well, it's a violent crime, right? So, you know, somebody, you know, created another problem, right? They didn't like somebody, so they said something derogatory to them, you know? So those things do exist in society, unfortunately, but we do have mechanisms to deal with.
I'd like to add one more thing. As you're looking to start working, I think one of the things that would be on you, and I would recommend you to do, is to try to do as much research into the company that you will finally join, and try to see if there's a cultural fit for you there. If you can tell, I know there's always this advertising department when you're looking in from the outside, but, you know, maybe do a little bit more research on that, so that you will be in an organization where you feel you will be able to speak. You know, do they have an open door policy? Is it going to be, do you have to go to your manager only? Are you able to, you know, just go to talk to anybody if you wanted to, if you had a concern? If you can get a sense for that culture, that will help you if you're ever in a situation where you need to voice a concern.
Okay, thank you.
You know, one other little comment on that. I think one of the things that you don't do as you start most jobs, and with all due respect to what was just said, and I appreciate it, because I agree with it. The fact of the matter is, I spent my entire career as a person of color, and none of the entities that I've ever worked in really looked very much like me. I was the only Black person teaching in the College of Business at the University of Minnesota. There were very few people of color teaching in Michigan State's business school. So what does that mean? All I'm saying is, one of the things you do need to do early on is figure out what your rights are. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, just figure out what your rights are. That means read things like your bylaws. Like most students don't ever read stuff like bylaws and where they work, or read the HR manual, just to figure out, how does this place sort of work? Then, once you've done that though, figure out, how do you get into spaces where you can make a difference? My contention is that women and people of color especially need to figure out how to get into rooms where decisions get made over time. And you can be very strategic about doing that. And I think something you can start early in your career, just start thinking about what would it be like for me to be a manager or whatever it is in the organization that I'm a part of.
I think we have another question.
So I know we talked about briefly that some companies have kind of like employee-led DEI efforts or organizations. I was just wondering if you had any suggestions for either how companies could help further foster these, or, you know, if you are an employee, like how you can best make change like through those.
So I'll just talk about where I work. We actually have what the company called the Culture Club. So there's a group of individuals, it's being sponsored by leadership, and it's literally talking about the culture of the organization. Different offices, you talk about what's going on. It kind of makes everybody feel inclusive or included. That culture club is something, I think that's kind of your question. I hope I'm answering it correctly. Okay, so that's what we SCS has done to foster that.
Do we have something online?
We do, yep, I don't know.
Let's go.
My question is, are there resources that, you know, state government agencies or federal government agencies, you know, need to develop, you know, and I know there's plenty of programs out there, but are there any more useful resources? I work for the state of Michigan, you know, and I'm just wondering, are there resources, and I know that we're from, not everyone's from Michigan, but you know, that the state or the federal government, you know, needs to step up and be helping, you know, industry and in your organizations that, you know, that would help accelerate DEI initiatives.
Not that I know of.
And I know, Bill, you work with
Yeah,
MBDA a lot
You know,
already.
so I'll say the federal government under current administration is definitely putting their money where their mouth is, right? So the Treasury Department has tied to most appropriations, some SETI is what they call it, SEDI requirements, and that's called socially economically disadvantaged individuals. Now, you have to go to the fact sheet of the government and drill down into that definition, but basically what it really is dealing with is the underserved, underrepresented population. It's not color, right? It's the underserved, underrepresented population. Well, they have taken an active stance in really putting money into the programming in which they funded that has within a lot of grants and other initiatives that language, right? Which means that they need to build programming within that and submit proposals that get funded through grant programs that actually meet that initiative.
I think we have another question or two online
Yes.
that we can still take.
Yes, so somebody asked, I'm in procurement and building our DEI policies and goals from the ground up. What is your advice for the early days of development?
Well, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, a good starting point is you're gonna have to decide which diversity categories that your company is seeking to grow. And one of the first kind of nuts and bolts type of thing to do is start categorizing and finding out of your current supply base. Well, you know, what diverse companies are you already trading with? And that starts to tell you at least what your starting point is, and you have to then work with leadership to set what your goals or objectives are going to be. You know, what does your company want to aspire to become? And then figuring out, okay, well, what are, like, say, 1-year goals or 2-year goals or whatnot? You got to break it down because it'll be too much to do all at once. And it takes time. So.
Just to follow up on that, are there any government or non-government organizations that set the standards in this area? I mean, how do we know that, okay, we achieved that objective or not? Because you talked about categories. Apparently, there are certain ways, structured ways of looking at this, right? But how a company makes a decision about, okay, we have implemented diversity and equity and inclusion, and we are there, we've done it. Are there any standards set by government organizations, or is it just the top management that decides whether they did that or not?
Well, if your organization sells to the US government, then yeah, there's plenty of standards. A whole bunch of definitions and regulations that you're, in need of following and needing to submit annual reports and set annual goals for. So that's something that our organization does on an annual basis. Because the US government's one of our largest customers. So we need to do that, but, going back to the way we started the discussion and, what does a supply chain program entail? And, if your organization is aspiring and trying to create a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion, boy, you'd be hard pressed to have that culture in your organization if you didn't have a supplier diversity program. It's one of the biggest ways that your organization can influence the communities where you're operating. So it's just got to be there.
In that same vein, I'm just curious,
Mhm.
the companies that do have DE&I policies, how many of these companies are very transparent about what is going on in their companies? How many women, how many people of color, how many, able-bodied people?
Yeah, I think that's a growing aspect. I can only really speak on that from our company. We produce something called an annual impact report. It's up on steelcase.com. Anybody's welcome to see it. And in there, we report out on what we're doing with things like supplier diversity, diversity in our dealership network, as well as our global talent programming, which is got a number of diversity goals within it, where we are trying to transform globally around the aspect of gender. So our different operating units report and identify how that's changing over time. And then within the US, it's broken down more than by gender, but by different ethnicities and whatnot in the employee base, not just at the regular salary level or hourly level, but manager and executive level as well. So it's all out there. I think more businesses are doing that more and more because of what their stakeholders are requiring them to be.
Because people do want to see that equity.
Yeah, they do.
We have one last question that's coming from our online audience to close out
Yes.
our discussion.
This question is for Steelcase. Can large US companies help minority-owned suppliers build international sales by promoting opportunities with their foreign subsidiaries?
Can you say that one more time, please?
Can large US companies help minority-owned suppliers build international sales by promoting opportunities with their foreign subsidiaries?
I'm not sure I understand that question completely. We do outsource some things offshore, and we have some foreign subsidiaries that we've purchased, but we don't really have a specific supplier diversity program functioning in those areas that are outside of the United States. If we make a decision to move the production of goods from, say, the US to offshore, there's a whole bunch of factors that would go into that. But for the most part, most of the products that we make and sell in the United States are made in the United States because of the cost, and then additionally just flat out the time that it takes to bring finished goods back to the US from offshore. It's not a lead time that our customer and market will support. So we tend to make most of the finished articles within the country or region that we're gonna sell it in.
Well, I would like to close out our panel discussion by first of all thanking the audience for engaging with us in the discussion about this important topic. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today here in person at Michigan State University. I really appreciate that you were able to share all your expertise and insights with us today concerning DEI and supply chain management. Thank you so much.